Europe shows no signs of abating. The depravity of the war was once again on full display yesterday following the missile strike in Kremenchuk in central Poltava region. Hundreds of people, perhaps even some trying to get a respite from the daily horrors of war, suffered one of the most shocking attacks of the conflict when a shopping center was hit by what are reported to be Russian missiles. 18 civilians were reportedly killed and 59 injured. The final toll may be much higher. This incident, which should be investigated, was the latest in a new wave of airstrikes and missile attacks in Kiev, Chernihiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv, Kharkiv, and other cities far from the front lines, with many civilians killed or injured. Presently, the most intense fighting is in and around the towns of Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Slavyansk, and Slavyansk in the Donbass. Heavy fighting is also reported around the cities of Kharkiv and Kherson. In scenes reminiscent of world wars, large-scale artillery duels are devastating industrial areas, with thousands of civilians forced to hide in basements or flee for their lives. Large military casualties are claimed on both sides. Mr. President, civilians continue to pay too high a price in this war. As of 26 June, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights recorded 10,631 civilian casualties in the country, 4,731 killed, and 5,900 injured. These are figures based on verified incidents. The actual figures are considerably higher. Most of the civilian casualties recorded were caused by explosive weapons with a wide impact area. Many of these weapons are inherently indiscriminate when used in populated areas and, therefore, result in increased civilian casualties and devastating humanitarian impacts. The Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded earlier this month its first mission to the country, including visits to Bucha, Irpin, Kharkiv, and Sumy. Though only in the initial stages of its work, the Commission received information and visited cities that, quote, may support claims that serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, perhaps reaching war crimes and crimes against humanity, have been committed, end quote. The work of the Commission of Inquiry, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and other fact-finding efforts are essential for establishing accountability for the crimes and atrocities committed during this war. This work must lead to justice. It is imperative for the people of Ukraine. It is also crucial if we hope to be able to prevent such violations in the future, wherever they threaten to occur. Mr. President, since 24 February, over 8.8 million people across Ukraine have received some form of humanitarian assistance and protection services. At least 16 million people need such aid. Needs are increasing, especially ahead of winter. Humanitarian partners are working on a winterization assistance plan and revising the flash appeal, which runs through August, to cover the needs through the end of 2022. Women, in particular, are facing immense hardship when it comes to health, safety, and access to food. A rapid gender analysis by UN Women in Care in April revealed that women are increasingly becoming heads of household and leaders in their communities as men are conscripted. They must be included in formal decision-making processes related to humanitarian efforts, peacemaking, and other areas that directly impact their lives. Perilous conditions are hampering efforts by humanitarian partners to reach civilians or for them to access the support they need. One statistic sheds light on this concern. Since 24 February, the World Health Organization has recorded 323 attacks on healthcare facilities and personnel, resulting in 76 deaths. We strongly remind all parties of their obligations under international humanitarian law. All adequate measures must be taken to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, Ukraine is suffering the largest human displacement crisis in the world today. Since the start of the Russian invasion, more than 1/4 of the country's population, 12 million people, have been forced from their homes. Within Ukraine, over 7.1 million people remain displaced by the war. UNHCR estimates there are over 5.2 million refugees present across Europe. Over 3.5 million refugees from Ukraine have registered for temporary protection or similar national protection schemes in Europe. The UN remains committed to provide support for the government-led responses in host countries. Also, given the increasing protracted nature of the conflict, we must not neglect Ukraine's long-term recovery and rebuilding needs. Using early socioeconomic assessments, UNDP launched a new resilience and recovery program to support the Ukrainian government's emergency response, its commitment to public services, and to keeping the economy running, as well as to help assess priority needs to deliver for the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, the war is having devastating consequences not only on the country and the immediate region, but far beyond Ukraine's borders. As the Secretary General noted on 8/9 during the launch of the second brief of the UN Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance, the war is exacerbating the greatest cost of living crisis in a generation. Price shocks in the global food, energy, and fertilizer markets are escalating in a world already grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. To address this multidimensional threat, strong political will across the multilateral community and a comprehensive approach is foremost necessary. Mr. President, we've run out of words to describe the senselessness, futility, and cruelty of this war. As the Secretary General warned, for those on the ground, every day brings new bloodshed and suffering. And for people around the world, the war, together with other crises, is threatening to unleash an unprecedented wave of hunger and destitution, leaving social and economic chaos in its wake. No country or community will be left untouched. The cycle of death, destruction, dislocation, and disruption must stop for the sake of Ukraine, Russia, and the entire world. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Di Carlo for her briefing. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President of Ukraine.
Thank you very much. Dear ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me thank the Albanian presidency in the UN Security Council for promptly convening this meeting at Ukraine's request and for the opportunity to address you. Unfortunately, as of now, the United Nations does not have a legal definition of the term terrorist state agreed by all UN members. But this war that Russia is waging against Ukraine demonstrates not only the meaning of this concept, but also the urgent necessity to enshrine it legally at the level of the United Nations and punish any terrorist state. Take a look at just recent events of a few recent days in Ukraine, a few from the 125 days of Russia's full-scale war of conquest against Ukraine. Saturday, 25th of June, 62 Russian missiles hit our cities. Sunday, 26th of June, and 10 more rockets. One of them hit a residential building in the capital city of Kyiv. 3 stories of a simple building were demolished. Another rocket exploded in the yard of an ordinary kindergarten. Monday, 27th of June, a missile strike in Kremenchuk. Those who carried out this strike could not have been unaware of directing a missile on a simple trade center, one of many shopping malls to be found everywhere in the world. As of now, 18 people are reported to have been killed, but unfortunately there may be more. Another 50 people are wounded and dozens are missing. 7 fragments of bodies have been found, ripped off limbs, hands and feet of the people. And if the Russian state claims that all these victims suffered not from its missile strike, then I suggest the United Nations send either a special representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations or a plenipotentiary commission to the site of this terrorist act at Kremenchuk, so that the UN could independently find out all the information and see that this indeed was a Russian missile strike. Yesterday, Russian army also used rocket artillery against a queue of people lined up for water that took place in the city of Lysychansk, Lugansk region. Ordinary, peaceful people, none of them served in the military, just a queue of people for water. 8 people were killed, including a 15-year-old boy named Danilo. The eldest of the victims was 68 years old. And I want you to hear the names of 4 women killed in the strike: Victoria, Irina, Olena, and Lyudmila. Almost on a daily basis, cruel Russian strikes are targeted against Kharkiv. Just yesterday, 9 were killed, 29 wounded, 5 of whom are children. I want you to know their names. Oleg, 8 years old, Mikhailo, 11 years old, Grigory, 9 years old, Artem, 10 years old, Gleb, 12 years old. That was a Russian artillery strike against ordinary residential buildings. Today, at 5 o'clock in the morning, the Russian army struck Mykolaiv and the town of Ochakiv in the Mykolaiv region. In Ochakiv, 3 people were killed. A girl, 6 years old, whose name was Eve. A man named Magomed, who was 76. A woman by the name of Galina, who was 50. Among the wounded is a child, a boy, 3 months of age. He was born after Russian full-scale invasion started. His name is Volodymyr, and he is severely injured. He is in intensive care. I stress once again, a child, a 3-month-old child. Two more missiles today hit the city of Sloviansk in Donbass. The long-suffering Donbass, tormented Donbass that Russia has humiliated since 2014. Just a few hours before this address of mine to you, to the UN Security Council, 2 missiles hit Odessa region. The city of Dnipro was also targeted, and one of the missiles destroyed a car service station, not a military station, but a usual car service. And I have a question to you, ladies and gentlemen. Who of you does not agree that this is terrorism? If in any other part of the world, any organization acted just like Russia, who is killing Ukrainians, if a country killed any peaceful people, that would definitely be recognized as terrorism. Such an organization would become an enemy for all of humankind. Therefore, what is punished at the level of concrete criminals and criminal organizations must not go unchecked at the level of the state, which has become a terrorist. Daily terrorist acts, without weekends, every day, they are working as terrorists. The UN Charter confers on the UN Security Council the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. Article 6 of Chapter 2 of the UN Charter clearly states that a member of the UN which has persistently violated the principles contained in the present Charter may be expelled from the organization by the General Assembly of the Security Council. Although Russia is violating fundamental principles of the UN and the international legal order, it is still not held to account at the global level. It still remains in UN agencies and even enjoys the privileges of the seat it occupies, the seat of the permanent member of the UN Security Council, which Russia occupies solely due to the short-sightedness of politicians at the end of the Cold War. Russia does not have the right to take part in discussing and voting in regard to the war in Ukraine, which is unprovoked and simply colonialist of the part of Russia. I urge you to deprive the delegation of the terrorist state of its powers in the UN General Assembly. That is possible, that is necessary, that is fair. Russia does not have the right to remain in the UNSC, and that path is not too arduous, as some may believe. If we exercise some consistency and appropriate political will, that is the only logical way for the UN Charter to work and be respected by all members of the organization. Furthermore, our organization now has sufficient strength to hold to account the terrorist state. Chapter 7 of the UN Charter allows establishing a special international tribunal for investigating the actions of Russian occupiers on Ukrainian soil. The word genocide has repeatedly been used, and all of you have seen what Russian occupiers have done in our city of Bucha. Each of you can obtain information on how many mass graves appeared around the single city of Mariupol after the Russian army razed it to the ground. It was a city of 500,000 residents, and now it lies in ruins. In the case of genocide in Rwanda, the UN Security Council established an international tribunal during 6 months since the beginning of the genocide. Since the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, more than 4 months have passed since the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine in Donbass and the occupation of Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea, which has been repeatedly condemned at the level of the UN General Assembly. More than 8 years have passed. We need to act urgently to do everything to make Russia stop the killing spree, the killings of children, people, everyone. We need to hold it to account for the terrorism. Otherwise, it will terrorist activity in other countries of Europe and Asia, Baltic states, Poland, Moldova, Kazakhstan. Many nations have already heard threats from Russian officials and state propagandists. I am grateful to all the diligent and civilized states who share our position and help defend the international legal order. This meeting of the UN Security Council is convened after the Russian missile strike in Kremenchuk. But in fact, the meeting of the UN Security Council may not be adjourned at all. It can go on round the clock, day after day, for us to have time to discuss every terrorist act of the Russian state. The UN Charter gives all the levers to influence any violator of the rules of the organization, any aggressor, any terrorist state. And I urge you to take advantage of these levers. It is imperative to deprive the Russian delegation of the opportunity to manipulate the UN. It is imperative to make it impossible for Russia to stay in the UN Security Council until its terrorism continues. It is imperative to establish a tribunal for investigating everything that the Russian military have done against Ukrainians, and it is imperative to give the legal definition of the notion state terrorism at the UN level. All Russian action must receive legal assessment and global sanctions for the fact that Russia is destructing international legal order. Thank you for your attention. I wish to say just one more thing. Various countries worldwide can have different attitudes to wars worldwide, but they similarly commemorate the victims, not only the military, but every person, every child who is dying, unfortunately, due to this tragedy, the tragedy of war. That is the usual thing. Usually treat with respect and sympathy those who have been unfairly killed, and only the killers do not commemorate those whom they have killed. And I ask you now, I will be very much grateful if you could commemorate all the Ukrainians who have been killed in this war, all the adults, all of our children, tens of thousands of people, and I ask you to commemorate them with a minute of silence. Thank you very much indeed. It is a great honor for us. Thank you for support. Thank you very much indeed.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Zelenskyy for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Albania. Thank you, USG Carlo, for this update. Again, a troubling one on this issue. Colleagues, a senseless war of aggression that could and must have been avoided has entered its 5th month. 125 days of outspread destruction, mounting civilian casualties, and continued pain inflicted on millions of people across Ukraine. Other millions across the world find themselves victims as collateral damage of a war that has nothing to do with them, that is weaponizing everything: energy, trade, communication, including primarily food. Colleagues, let's remind ourselves, on 29th March, 5 weeks after the start of its war of choice in Ukraine, Russia announced its withdrawal of forces from the Kyiv area. The reason provided then was that it was a goodwill gesture to favor negotiations between the parties. The truth proved very different. The attempt to take in Kyiv failed spectacularly. Negotiations went nowhere. War intensified instead. Russia continues its massive assault on Ukraine, threatening Europe, running against every human effort invested since World War II to build global peace through the international rule of law. As war has shifted ferociously to the east, life returned to some sort of normalcy in Kiev until missiles starting again falling from the sky with an unmistaken message: Russia can hit you at will, anywhere, anytime, just because it can. Last Sunday, nearly 1,000 people found themselves under a Russian airstrike which hit a shopping mall in the city of Kremenchuk in central Ukraine. Reportedly, tens of people lost their lives and several dozens were injured. What possible justification can be provided to missiles thrown over a commercial center in the very heart of an urban area? What can possibly explain such blatant, indiscriminate brutality against civilians? We have heard so many times Russia has continued to deny struggling civilians, but overwhelming evidence like this one proves again and again the contrary. Have we forgotten that Kiev was deliberately targeted last April as the UN Secretary General was visiting the city? Reports speak now of deliberate attacks in protesting to the G7 meeting. If it were so, why should civilians, including children, pay the price of such despicable symbolism? Indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure and innocent civilians constitute war crimes. We all know it. Those who decide to attack shopping centers, shelters, schools, hospitals, kindergarten, apartment buildings are well aware of possible civilian casualties. They know they are committing war crimes when their responsibility is to protect civilians. They must pay for these actions. Colleagues, this aggression is not limited to Ukraine only. Zealous commentators of the state propaganda, but also senior Kremlin officials, fill the air with worst-case scenario of deploying weapons of mass destruction, including, as we have heard more than once, nuclear saber-rattling. We notice a dramatic increase of cyber warfare and advanced disinformation attacks. Further, the current food insecurity crisis continues to spread around the world. Global food prices are now at an all-time high. This is the parallel war that Russia is waging against the world. It has transformed the war in Ukraine from a local act of aggression to an acute international challenge. We know that millions of tons of grain are piled in Ukraine. Out of it, 8 million tons are said to be in the occupied areas of Russia, and Russia is reportedly stealing it from Ukraine. A meticulous and professional investigation from the BBC shows how this is carried out in Donbas, and not only for the grain, but also for other Ukrainian assets. Russia has already occupied 20% of the Ukrainian territory, but its appetite has increased. Colleagues, this war is paralyzing Ukraine. It is destroying its industry, its roads and schools and its health system along the way. It is killing civilians, it is punishing its youth, and is destroying the fabric of a society. But also it is testing the resolve of all those who truly believe in the rules-based international order, in the respect of the UN Charter. Therefore, this is no time to stay aside. International support for Ukraine and its people is a moral and solidarity issue. It is to choose to stand on the right side, that of the law, of rights, of life, of dignity. One day this war will be over, but the way it will end matters to all of us. If we want to preserve the rule of law, we must make sure that everyone knows the cost of aggression against another country. We welcome the recent commitments of G7 for a new package of coordinated actions aimed at increasing pressure on Russia over its war in Ukraine. We also welcome the latest decision of the European Union. Colleagues, let me end with this. This war must stop with full and immediate withdrawal of the Russian forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. The sooner, the better for all, Ukraine, for Russia, and the entire world. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your compelling, if ultimately heartbreaking, briefing. I thank President Zelenskyy for addressing the Council again today. We were honored by his presence here, but I think we're all horrified by the circumstances under which we meet. And we express our deepest condolences to him and the people of the Ukraine for the horrors they continue to suffer on a daily basis, including the senseless attack by Putin's forces that destroyed the shopping center in Kremenchuk. America stands, as always, united with Ukraine. It would already be an outrage if yesterday's attack was a horrific exception, but it is not even that. The attack fits into a cruel pattern, one where the Russian military kills civilians and destroys civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. The Kremlin has demonstrated time and time again that it is trying to subjugate Ukraine, its sovereignty, its people, its spirit. Putin keeps trying to intimidate and divide Ukraine's partners. We have shown and will continue to show that our support for Ukraine is resolute. I expect the representative from the Russian Federation in a moment to try to obfuscate, to avoid responsibility and blame others for this tragedy. But no one here will be fooled. We all see the grim reality for what it is, and the reality is that Russia's war of choice has led directly to the destruction of crowded malls, grocery stores, theaters, hospitals, and schools, and the innocent civilians inside them. Make no mistake, there is ample, publicly available evidence that Russia, and Russia alone, is responsible for these attacks. And make no mistake, deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilians and civilian objects constitute war crimes. The United States has previously assessed that members of Russia's armed forces have committed war crimes in Ukraine. I repeat, to be clear, war crimes. The evidence is mounting and it cannot be ignored. We have seen too many credible reports of the bombing of schools and hospitals, like the maternity hospital in Mariupol, the killing of aid workers, the targeting of civilians attempting to flee for their lives or standing in line for water, as the president just reminded us. We've seen forced relocation of thousands of Ukrainian civilians and the brutal execution-style murder of those going about their daily business in Bucha. We call upon all fellow council members, including those who are failing to condemn what is in front of them, to speak the full truth. We all have a responsibility to make clear the moral culpability that Russia holds in this war of choice. There's no such thing as both sides when it comes to these recent attacks. The international community must hold those who perpetrated and ordered these crimes to account. Justice must be served. Justice must come for Russia's military and political leadership, as well as for its military rank and file who commit war crimes or other atrocities. The United States supports all international investigations into these crimes, including those being conducted by the ICC, the UN, and the OSCE. We have welcomed the International Criminal Court's decision to open an investigation into atrocity crimes committed in Ukraine. And with our EU colleagues, we are supporting the Ukrainian national authorities, specifically the Office of the Prosecutor General, as these authorities investigate and prepare to prosecute war crimes cases. At the same time, the world has come together to say enough is enough. Just yesterday, leaders of G7 countries reaffirmed our solidarity and unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty. Our leaders made clear that we will help Ukraine defend itself and choose its own future, free from external pressure or influence. And the United States and the world will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. We will not rest until Russia ends this cruel and senseless war. How many more attacks will there be before those on this council who continue to tap dance around Russia's culpability demonstrate that they care more about the protection of civilians than protecting their own interests, and start speaking of the steps Russia needs to take to resolve the crisis that it started? Colleagues, Russia started this war. Russia is the one committing atrocities against civilians, and only Russia can end this war by withdrawing its forces from Ukraine and reaching a political settlement with Ukraine's democratically elected government. Let us all continue to do everything in our power to see that day soon. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. Et je donne maintenant la parole au représentant de la
And I give the
France.
floor to the representative of France. Monsieur le Président,
President,
je remercie Madame Di
I would
Carlo
like
pour
to
sa
thank Ms. Di
présentation.
Carlo for her briefing.
Je salue la participation
And I
du président
welcome
Zelenskyy
the participation
et
of President
l'assure
Zelenskyy
de la pleine
and can
solidarité de la
assure him of
France
France's full
envers l'Ukraine.
solidarity with Ukraine.
La France condamne avec la
France
plus grande fermeté
condemns
la frappe russe
categorically
hier contre un
the
centre
Russian
commercial
strike
dans la
yesterday
ville
against a
de
shopping centre
Kremenchuk
in the town
qui a
of
fait, selon un
Kremenchuk,
bilan provisoire,
which,
au moins une
according to
dizaine
provisional
de
estimate,
victimes.
has claimed at least
Cette attaque
10
injustifiable,
victims. This
mais que la dernière en
unjustifiable
date
attack
d'une
is
longue
only
série.
the latest in a
Ces
long
derniers jours,
string.
l'armée russe a
In recent
pilonné
days, the
délibérément
Russian
le
army has
territoire
deliberately
ukrainien,
bombarded
prenant pour
Ukrainian
cible des
territory,
zones résidentielles
targeting
et des
residential
infrastructures
zones and
civiles,
civilian infrastructure.
loin des zones de combat.
Far from combat
Le bilan est
zones.
lourd.
The
À
cost has been
Kharkiv,
high.
à
In
Lysychansk
Kharkiv, in
et dans le
Lysychansk,
centre-ville de Kiev,
and in
les
the
missiles
center of
russes
Kyiv,
ont fait plusieurs
Russian
morts
missiles
et des
have
dizaines de
caused
blessés.
several deaths and dozens
Depuis
of
le début de
injured.
cette guerre,
Since the
la
beginning of
Russie a
this
fait le
war,
choix de
Russia
prendre
has
pour cible
chosen
les
to target
populations, tuant
populations,
des enfants,
killing children,
des personnels humanitaires,
humanitarian
des
personnel
journalistes.
and
Elle continue à
journalists.
détruire sans
Russia
relâche des
continues
infrastructures
relentlessly
civiles.
to destroy
Il
civilian
s'agit là
infrastructure.
d'une tactique de guerre
This is a
visant à
tactic of
terroriser
war
et
aimed
affaiblir le
at
moral du peuple
terrorizing
ukrainien.
and demoralizing
Ce
the
faisant,
Ukrainian people.
la Russie
In
continue
doing
de
this,
violer
Russia
les
continues to
principes les
violate
plus
the most
élémentaires
elementary
du droit
principles of
international
international
humanitaire,
humanitarian law.
après avoir piétiné la Charte des Nations
After
Unies
having
et ses
trampled
principes
underfoot
fondateurs,
the Charter of the United
comme l'a
Nations
clairement
and its founding
énoncé
principles,
la
as
Cour
so clearly
internationale de
stated by the
justice le
International
16
Court
mars
of Justice
dernier.
on the 16th of March last.
Monsieur le Président,
President,
je le dis avec fermeté,
I say this with no
les criminels de
hesitation.
guerre seront traduits en
War
justice.
criminals shall be
La
brought to
France
justice.
continuera à
France
appuyer
will
le
continue
travail
to support the
des
work
juridictions
of
et mécanismes
international,
internationaux,
regional and
régionaux et
national
nationaux
jurisdictions
pour
and
s'assurer que les
mechanisms to
faits commis
ensure
en
that the
Ukraine,
acts committed in
dont
Ukraine,
certains pourraient constituer des
some of
crimes de
which may
guerre et des crimes
constitute war
contre
crimes and
l'humanité,
crimes against
ne
humanity,
resteront pas
do not go
impunis.
unpunished.
La France renouvelle son appel à
France
coopérer
renews
avec
its call
la
to
Cour pénale
cooperate with the
internationale
International
ainsi
Criminal
qu'avec
Court
les mécanismes
and
d'enquête.
with the
Elle
investigation
maintiendra
mechanisms.
la pression
France
pour
will
contraindre
continue to
les
exert
autorités
maximum
russes à
pressure
mettre
to
fin
compel
à cette
the Russian
guerre.
authorities to
Le
bring an
monde
end to this
entier
war.
est affecté
The
par
whole
ce
world is
conflit.
affected by the
Il risque
conflict.
de faire basculer
It
un
could
cinquième de la population mondiale dans la
cause a fifth
pauvreté
of the world's
et
population to slide
l'insécurité
into
alimentaire.
poverty and
Et la
food
Russie
insecurity.
en porte l'entière
And Russia
responsabilité.
bears the full responsibility.
Il est
It is
inacceptable qu'elle
unacceptable
utilise la faim
for Russia
comme un
to use
levier
hunger as a
politique.
political
Je
lever.
tiens à le rappeler,
I
les
wish to
sanctions
recall this.
adoptées
The
à
sanctions
son encontre,
adopted against
contrairement
Russia,
à ce qui se raconte, ne
unlike
visent
what is
ni les
being said,
céréales,
do not
ni les
target
biens
cereals
agricoles,
or
ni les
agricultural
engrais.
goods or fertilizers.
La Russie doit lever le blocus
Russia
des
must
ports
lift
ukrainiens
the
en mer
blockade
Noire
on
afin
Ukrainian
de
ports in
permettre
the Black Sea
l'exportation des
in order
denrées
to allow the
alimentaires.
export of
La France
foodstuffs.
soutient pleinement
France
les efforts
fully supports the
déployés
efforts
par le
deployed
secrétaire
by the
général à
Secretary
cet
General in
égard.
this regard.
Monsieur le Président, la France
President,
appelle la Russie à
France calls
respecter
upon
ses
Russia to
engagements
uphold its
internationaux,
international commitments,
à cesser les
to
hostilités,
cease hostilities,
à retirer
to withdraw
ses forces
its
armées
armed
d'Ukraine
forces from Ukraine,
et à mettre un terme
and to
à
bring an
cette
end
guerre
to this
injustifiable et
unjustifiable and
dévastatrice.
devastating war.
L'accès humanitaire doit être garanti, en particulier dans les
Humanitarian
régions
access
les
must
plus
be
touchées
guaranteed,
par les combats.
particularly in those regions
Face au
most affected
défi
by combat.
historique que représente
In the face
le
of the
retour
historic
de la guerre en
challenge
Europe,
posed by the return of
l'Union
war in
européenne
Europe, the European
a décidé
Union has
d'octroyer à
decided to
l'Ukraine le
grant
statut de
Ukraine the
candidat à
status
l'adhésion,
of an
car
accession
aujourd'hui,
candidate.
le peuple ukrainien se bat
Because
pour
today, the people
défendre
of Ukraine
nos valeurs
are
et
fighting to
celles
defend
promues
our
par la
values
Charte des
and
Nations
those
Unies.
promoted by the Charter
La
of the United
France,
Nations.
qui a déjà mobilisé
France
2 milliards
has
de
already
dollars
mobilized
pour le
$2
soutien
billion
économique et
for
humanitaire,
economic and humanitarian
continuera
assistance and
de se
will
tenir
continue to
résolument
stand shoulder to
aux côtés
shoulder
des Ukrainiens,
with
dont
Ukrainian
je veux
people.
ici à
And I
nouveau
take this
saluer le
opportunity here
courage.
to
Je
salute
vous
once again
remercie.
their courage. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant de la
I
France
thank the
pour sa
representative of
déclaration.
France for his statement.
And I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank the Albanian presidency for convening this urgent Security Council meeting on the conflict in Ukraine. And I thank Undersecretary Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. Brazil received with deep concern recent news of airstrikes on or near densely populated areas in Ukrainian cities, of which the commercial center of Kremenchuk yesterday is the most dramatic example. We deeply regret the loss of human life and the destruction of urban and industrial infrastructure, which will be undoubtedly have serious consequences for the already dire humanitarian situation in the country. Attacks against civilian objects, especially in densely populated areas, encourage a perverse logic of retaliation. We urge the parties to allow an impartial investigation into these incidents and to refrain from actions that could result in increased civilian casualties. Brazil reiterates its call for parties to respect their obligations under the UN Charter and international humanitarian law, including observing the principles of distinction and proportionality. This comprises the protection of civilians in all circumstances, entailing the exercise of restraint by military forces and the establishment of mechanisms for evacuating areas directly impacted by operations. We encourage parties to engage in constructive dialogue to achieve this common goal. Mr. President, 4 months after the start of the conflict, it should be clear that there is no alternative to a political solution. It is unreasonable for military operations to be prolonged, with no prospect for an end to the immense human suffering imposed on civilian populations. We renew our appeal for an immediate cessation of hostilities and the establishment of peace negotiations without delay or preconditions. This Council is responsible for creating conditions for dialogue. We should redouble efforts to seek solutions that favor peace negotiations and minimize the impacts of the conflict, both in Ukraine and in other affected regions. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking USG DiCarlo for her briefing. And while we welcome President Zelensky's participation, again, we deeply regret the circumstances that brought him here today. President, just over 4 months since the start of its illegal invasion, Russia's war against Ukraine continues. Russia continues to pummel Ukraine's eastern Donbass region in an effort to seize full control. And over the weekend, Russia launched an intense barrage of cruise missile attacks at targets across Ukraine, including hitting a shopping centre in Kremenchuk with over 1,000 people inside. We heard from President Zelenskyy the roll call of the recent dead and extend our condolences to their families and their friends. When the world calls for peace, for dialogue, and adherence to international law, Russia answers with escalation, with missiles, and targeting civilians. More attacks, more destruction, more death, and as I'm sure we will hear again today, more war propaganda, more lies, more disinformation. Nor can we ignore the prominent role of Belarus in acting as a direct staging post for the attacks over the weekend and yesterday. We praise the extraordinary bravery and resolve of the Ukrainian people in the face of this brutal assault on its sovereignty and territorial integrity and its very existence as a country. Ukraine is entitled to defend itself as any of us would if our cities, towns and villages were subject to repeated relentless missile strikes by a foreign army focused on wiping out our existence. So we will continue to support Ukraine to exercise this right of self-defense and to re-secure its privileges and rights under the UN Charter. We yet again reiterate the calls of the international community for Russia to end its illegal invasion, withdraw outside Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, and enter into dialogue and negotiation. At a time when we are facing the existential threats of climate change and food insecurity following a global pandemic, Russia must end its illegal war and its blockade of Ukraine's ports. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and I would like to thank the Under-Secretary General for her briefing, a briefing which highlights yet again the brutality of this unlawful war. For 4 months, Mr. President, we have called for an end to the unjustified and unjustifiable war being waged against Ukraine. Yet, as each day passes, reports of violations of human rights and international humanitarian law by Russia grow. Civilians in Ukraine continue to pay the highest price. On Monday, Russian forces attacked a shopping mall in Kremenchuk, full of civilians going about their ordinary lives. This appears to have been a clear attack against civilians and civilian infrastructure in flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. The consequences of this attack, reported by credible media sources, is civilians killed. Mr. President, we have heard today how civilians continue to bear the brunt of Russia's unconscionable war. All allegations of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law must be investigated and those responsible held to account. Parties to conflict must comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligation to distinguish between civilians and combatants and to attack only military objectives. The prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks, and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. Mr. President, compliance is not optional. Yesterday's Russian strike on Kremenchuk is not the first on Ukraine's towns and cities, we know. We deplore Russia's use of explosive weapons, including prohibited cluster munitions, in populated areas without regard for civilians. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine has recorded over 10,000 civilian casualties, most of which have been caused by the use of explosive weapons. We condemn indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks in all circumstances. We are committed to ensuring accountability for the atrocious crimes taking place in Ukraine and recognise the important role of the ongoing investigation of the International Criminal Court in helping to pursue this. We must not accept impunity for those inflicting such horrors, not in Ukraine, not anywhere in the world. We once again call on the Russian Federation to comply with its obligations under international law. There must be full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access for humanitarian personnel to reach civilians, including those who choose to remain in Ukraine and those who are unable to depart, including the elderly. They are not combatants and must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. The Russian Federation must allow those seeking to leave their towns and cities in Ukraine to do so safely to destinations of their own choosing. President, Russia can end its aggression if it chooses, but even while it chooses to execute an illegal war, it still has obligations under international law, and it must comply with those obligations. We call again on the Russian Federation to end its war and to withdraw all forces unconditionally from the entirety of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Under Secretary General, Madam Rosemary DiCarlo, for her briefing, as well as His Excellency President Zelenskyy for his address. Kenya stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine who are suffering the failure of the multilateral system to bring an end to a war that continues unabated in disregard of the raison d'etre of the United Nations to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, a war whose catastrophic impact in Ukraine and across the world is worsening by the day. We are gravely concerned by the latest developments, especially in Mykolaiv, Yoniv, Zhytomyr, Lviv, Odessa, and Cherkasy regions, as well as in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Kremenchuk cities. The reported intensified airstrikes and missile shelling in these regions and cities are destroying civilian objects with a growing toll on civilian casualties. These indiscriminate acts constitute a violation of the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law. Kenya condemns the disproportionate use of force and the targeting of civilians and objects indispensable to the survival of civilian populations, including residential homes, health facilities, shelters, shopping malls, as well as power and water infrastructure. We are concerned that the continued destruction of civilian infrastructure is significantly impeding Ukraine's ability to engage in international trade, including the export of key commodities, particularly agricultural products and farm inputs, such as fertilizer. In addition, the blockade of Ukraine's access to the Black Sea has disrupted the global food supply chain, and this is worsening food insecurity, especially in conflict situations and fragile economies in the global south. With the surging inflation rates and the spike in food and fuel prices globally, this armed conflict is undermining efforts to build back from the COVID-19 pandemic. We commend the Secretary General for his efforts, including the establishment of the Global Crisis Response Group on Food, Energy, and Finance. This is a good first step towards the establishment of instruments that can cushion the most vulnerable from the effects of the conflict. Of critical importance, Mr. President, is the imperative to immediately stop further infliction of suffering on civilians, especially the vulnerable groups, including women, children, and the elderly. We therefore urge the parties to adhere to international humanitarian law, including the 4 1949 Geneva Conventions and its first additional protocol of 1977, as well as ensure the protection of civilian population and detainees. We call on them to shift their focus to an immediate cessation of the war, refrain from any actions that may further escalate the situation, and prioritize the use of diplomatic tools to resolve the conflict. The cessation should set the foundation for a lasting peace settlement that respects the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. It should also lead to the design of a European security order that offers lasting security and not a generation of new wars in Europe or elsewhere. Finally, I reaffirm Kenya's respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, let me thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing to the Council on the prevailing situation in Ukraine and the rising humanitarian suffering occasioned by the war. I also acknowledge the virtual participation of the President of Ukraine, His Excellency, Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskyy. My delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Ghana is gravely concerned by the reports of the intensification of military bombardments in several regions across Ukraine over the past couple of days, and for which the ordinary people, especially women and children, are having to pay the highest price. We remain concerned that residential areas continue to be the target of missile launches and bombardments, and regret that such places have increasingly become the arena for combat. In this context, we call for an independent, impartial, and transparent investigations into the Kremenchuk mall attack which occurred yesterday and resulted in several casualties. Over the last 4 months, the war has continued unabated under conditions that have precipitated considerable human suffering and despair. While the present situation casts a grim outlook for peace, as purveyors of global peace and security, we cannot and must not lose hope of finding peace in the interest of the conflicting parties and the wider international community. With each passing day, the urgency to find a peaceful and durable solution to the conflict grows. The snowballing effect of the collateral economic impact on the rest of the international community, especially developing countries which already are burdened by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and other pressing global challenges, could soon go beyond the reach of easy resolution. It is therefore our plea that ongoing diplomatic efforts should be given an opportunity for the cause of peace and the abatement of this needless war on the basis of a commitment to genuine and unconditional dialogue. We welcome the positive results that follow the Secretary General's visit to Kyiv and Moscow during the month of April, which demonstrate for us the utility of the United Nations in such delicate circumstances. We encourage the parties to accept the good offices of the Secretary General in repairing the broken trust occasioned by the war against Ukraine in order to move forward toward negotiations. We call for an immediate cessation of military engagements in areas populated by civilians and urge the urgent creation of demilitarized humanitarian corridors in all besieged areas in compliance with the precepts of international law and international humanitarian law. We note the obligation of the conflicting parties to proactively protect civilians and civilian infrastructure from harm. Similarly, aid and humanitarian workers must be afforded equal treatment of protection. In concluding, we urge maximum restraint and encourage rhetoric that is facilitative of a peaceful process. Finally, we reiterate our call to the members of this Council to harness all efforts in bringing an end to this war and restoring peace and stability to Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ghana for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President.
Agradezco a la
I
subsecretaria
thank
DiCarlo
Undersecretary
por su
General DiCarlo
presentación
for her briefing.
y al presidente Zelenskyy,
And President
quien se ha
Zelenskyy,
dirigido nuevamente a este
who has
Consejo
spoken to this
el día de hoy.
Council once again today.
El pasado 24 de
The
junio
24th
se
of June
cumplieron 4
marked
meses
4 months
del inicio de esta
since the
guerra.
beginning of this war.
Lamentablemente, de nueva cuenta,
Unfortunately,
se
once
ha
again,
registrado
there has
un
been an
incremento en los
increase
ataques
in
en
attacks
contra de la
against
infraestructura
civilian
civil
infrastructure
y en zonas
and
muy pobladas
very
en diversas
populated
regiones de
areas in
Ucrania,
various regions of Ukraine,
incluida Kiev,
including Kyiv
y de manera señalada
and
en Luhansk
particularly
y
in
Donetsk.
Luhansk and Donetsk.
Condenamos el ataque de ayer a un centro
We condemn
comercial
yesterday's attack
en
on a
Kremenchuk,
shopping center in
en el que
Kremenchuk,
se encontraba un numeroso grupo de
a shopping
personas,
center with
de
many
civiles.
civilians inside it.
Aún no se tiene el saldo final,
We do not know
pero hasta ahora al menos 18 muertos y
the
decenas
final number
de
of deaths yet, but there are at least 18
Lamentable.
deaths and dozens
Un
of
ataque de
injured,
esta
which is
naturaleza
deplorable.
es contrario
An
al
attack
derecho
of this kind
internacional
runs counter to
y al derecho
international law
internacional humanitario.
and international humanitarian
Respaldamos el llamado
law.
del coordinador
We
humanitario para
support the call
Ucrania
of the
en
humanitarian
el
coordinator
sentido
for
de
Ukraine
iniciar sin
for a
dilación
prompt
una
independent
investigación
investigation
independiente
to begin
sobre estos
into
hechos.
these facts.
De igual forma, reiteramos nuestro
Likewise, we
apoyo al
reiterate our
fiscal de la Corte
support
Penal
for the prosecutor
Internacional
of the
en
International
sus
Criminal Court
investigaciones sobre
in
posibles
investigating
crímenes de
possible
guerra
war crimes
cometidos
committed
en
in
Ucrania.
Ukraine.
Resultan asimismo injustificables los
Equally
bombardeos en áreas
unjustifiable are the
residenciales
bombardments of residential
múltiples
areas in
poblaciones
numerous
del
places
Donbass
in the Donbass,
que han destruido
which have
infraestructura
destroyed
crítica de
critical
comunicaciones y
communications,
servicios.
infrastructure and
Han
services.
afectado gravemente la
These
provisión
have
de
seriously
servicios
affected the
esenciales
provision of
de
essential
salud,
health
así
services
como el acceso
and
a varias
access to
ciudades
various
de la
cities
región.
of the region.
Hacemos un llamado urgente
We call
para que se
urgently
permita el acceso
for safe,
seguro e irrestricto
unhindered
a
access
todo el
to be
personal
provided
que
to all
presta ayuda
humanitarian
humanitaria.
personnel.
Una de las principales
One
premisas
of
del
the
derecho
main
internacional
precepts of
humanitario
international
es el
humanitarian
principio
law
de
is the
distinción,
principle of distinction.
toda vez que su objetivo final
And one of its
es evitar
ultimate
siempre que sea
objectives is to
posible
avoid,
el
whenever possible,
sufrimiento de la
civilian
población
suffering
o en su caso reducir al máximo el daño
and
que
to
se le
reduce
pueda
damage
causar.
to a minimum.
No respetar este principio
Failing to respect this
viola
principle is a
flagrantemente el
flagrant
derecho
violation
internacional
of
humanitario.
international humanitarian
Lo
law.
mismo podemos decir que ocurre
The same
con el
applies
uso de municiones
to the
en
use
racimo.
of
Son
cluster
armas
munitions.
que están prohibidas
These are
por el
weapons which
derecho
are prohibited
internacional
by
humanitario.
international humanitarian
Señor
law.
presidente, preocupa
President,
sobremanera
The
la
proliferation
proliferación de
of
armas en la
weapons is
región.
particularly worrisome in the
Se trata de
region.
un factor de
This
volatilidad
is a cause of
adicional,
additional
pues su
volatility,
creciente
since
disponibilidad
their
en manos de
increased
población
availability to
civil
civilians
propicia la continuación
makes
de los
continued
conflictos.
conflict increasingly likely.
Excelencias, convengamos en
Excellencies,
que urgen
we
la
must agree that
mediación y el
mediation
diálogo
and dialogue
que lleven a un
resulting in
cese
a
al
full
fuego total.
ceasefire are a matter of urgency.
Esa y no otra
This
debiera
and
ser
this
la
alone
prioridad de este
must be the
Consejo.
priority of this Council.
Pero en tanto esto es posible,
But until this
resulta
happens,
prioritario
it is a
incrementar las
priority
pausas
to increase the
humanitarias que
humanitarian
garanticen
pauses,
la evacuación
which
segura y
guarantee safe,
voluntaria de la
voluntary
población
evacuation of the
y encontrar
population,
mecanismos para
and to
movilizar
find mechanisms
granos,
to mobilize
fertilizantes y otros
grain,
insumos
fertilizer,
básicos
and other
que se
commodities
encuentran
which are
confinados por la
blocked
guerra en Ucrania
by the war in
y que
Ukraine,
aumentan las precarias
and which are
condiciones de
worsening the
insuficiencia
precarious
alimentaria
situations
en
of
muchas
food
otras
insufficiency
regiones
in many
del
other
mundo.
regions of the world.
Urge parar la guerra. Gracias,
Bringing an
presidente.
end to the war is a matter of urgency. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Прежде чем я начну свое выступление,
Before I begin my statement,
хотел бы заявить следующее.
I would like to say the following.
У нас вызывает серьезную
We are greatly
озабоченность
concerned
линия
by the
албанского
line taken
председательства
by the Albanian
по вопросу
presidency
об участии
regarding
президента
the
Зеленского в сегодняшнем
participation of
заседании.
President Zelensky in today's meeting.
По этому поводу не было проведено
No
консультаций
consultations
со всеми
were
членами
held with all
Совета.
the members of the Council on this matter.
Делегации были фактически поставлены перед фактом в
Delegations were
последний
essentially
момент.
presented with a fait accompli at the last possible
Это
moment.
нарушает сложившуюся
This
практику
violates
и
existing
традиции
practice
работы
and
Совета
the
Безопасности.
traditions of the work of the Security Council.
Президенту Зеленскому уже была
President
предоставлена
Zelensky was
возможность
already
выступить в
provided with an
Совете в качестве
opportunity to
исключения.
address the Council once as a matter of
И как
exception,
заверяло
and
тогдашнее
as
британское
the then
председательство,
British
без создания
presidency
прецедента.
assured without creating a presidency.
Не
A
видим оснований для того,
precedent.
чтобы
We do
плодить
not see any
эти
basis to
исключения.
keep propagating such exceptions.
Мы с вами неоднократно подтверждали
We have all together repeatedly
понимание о том,
reaffirmed the
что представители
understanding
государств,
that
желающие
representatives of
выступить в
states
Совете,
who
должны
wish
физически
to speak in the
присутствовать в
Council
зале
must be
заседаний.
physically present in the chamber.
Совет Безопасности ООН не
The
должен
UN Security
превращаться в
Council
площадку
should
для
not be turned into
дистанционной
a platform
агит-кампании
for
президента
a
Зеленского
remote PR
по
campaign for
выклячиванию
President
оружия у участников
Zelenskyy
саммита НАТО.
in order to get more weapons from participants of the NATO
Это подрывает
summits. This
авторитет
undermines the
Совета как
authority of the
органа,
Council as a body
ответственного за
responsible
коллективную
for
выработку решений
collective
по поддержанию
decisions on the
международного мира и
maintenance of
безопасности.
international peace and security.
Украинская сторона с подачи наших западных
The
коллег
Ukrainian party, at the instigation of our
пытается
Western
этот
colleagues,
авторитет
is
подорвать
attempting to
и превратить
undermine
членов Совета
this
в зрительскую
authority
аудиторию для
and turn the
актерских
members of the
представлений.
Council into an audience for acting performances.
Хочу обратить внимание, что буквально
I wish
неделю
to draw
назад
attention to the fact that just a week
возможности
ago,
дистанционно выступить в Совете было отказано
the
министру иностранных
Minister of
дел
Foreign
ЦАР.
Affairs of the Central African Republic was refused the opportunity to speak to the Council.
Совет не должен
The
проявлять
Council should
двойные
not
стандарты
demonstrate double
в угоду украинской
standards
стороне
in
и
order to
ее
serve the
западным
Ukrainian party
покровителям,
and its Western backers,
дискриминируя при этом африканские
discriminating
страны.
against African states while they do so.
Исключения не должны делаться ни для кого.
There should not be any exceptions for anyone.
Господин председатель,
Mr. President,
с самого начала специальной
from the
военной
very
операции на
beginning of the
Украине,
special military operation in
направленной на
Ukraine,
прекращение
which was
восьмилетней войны
aimed at
киевского
ending the
режима
8-year
против мирного
war
населения
of the
востока
Kiev regime
Украины,
against the civilian population of
мы
eastern
столкнулись с
Ukraine,
тем, что реальная
we were faced
ситуация на
with the
фронтах
fact
не
that
была главной
the
заботой
true situation on the
украинских
front
властей.
line was not the main concern of Ukrainian authorities.
Их гораздо больше
They were
волновал
much
другой
more
фронт,
concerned
информационный,
about another front, the
за
information
обработку
front,
которого
which
они вместе
they,
с западными
together
пиарщиками,
with their
пропагандистами и
Western
постановщиками
PR
взялись с
propagandist
особым рвением.
collaborators took up with special zeal.
Если кто-то постарается подсчитать
If
все
someone were to
брошенные
try
украинские
counting
фейки,
all the Ukrainian fakes that have been disseminated thus
то их
far,
явно хватит на
there would easily
увесистый
be
книжный том,
enough for a weighty
а то и на
tome
собрание
or
сочинений.
even a collected body of works.
Чего стоит красивая, но
Just take
абсолютно
the
лживая
beautiful but
легенда с
absolutely
русским кораблем,
false legend about the Russian ship
которому храбрые
to
защитники
which
острова
the
Змеиный
brave
якобы
defenders of
отказались
Snake
сдаться и
Island
поплатились за
allegedly
это жизнью,
refused to surrender and for which they paid with their lives.
за что и получили от президента Зеленского звание Героев
They
Украины
were awarded the
посмертно.
title of Heroes of Ukraine posthumously for this
Правда,
by
потом
President
выяснилось, что весь
Zelenskyy.
украинский гарнизон остался
Of
жив
course, it
и
later turned out that the
благополучно
entire
сдался
Ukrainian
российской
garrison
армии.
of the island was alive and well and had safely surrendered to the Russian
Но
army.
легенду переписывать не стали. И
But
на
the
Украине до
legend
сих пор
was
гордо
not
выпускают
rewritten,
марки с
and
этой
Ukraine
патриотической
still
историей.
proudly issues stamps with this patriotic story.
А знаменитый летчик-ас, призрак Киева,
How about the famous
который якобы
ace
держал в
pilot, the
страхе
Phantom of
российские
Kiev, who
военно-воздушные силы
allegedly terrorized the
и сбил
Russian Air
десятки
Force and
российских
shot down
самолетов.
dozens of Russian aircraft?
И ничего, что его подвиги
No matter that
иллюстрировались
his
фрагментами из
exploits were
компьютерных
illustrated
игр
with fragments from
или
computer
старыми
games
роликами из
or
интернета.
old internet videos.
Потом, правда, даже западные
Later on,
журналисты,
however,
скрипя сердце,
even
признали,
Western
что это
journalists
выдумка.
reluctantly had to admit that this
Но
was a
некоторые украинские
fabrication.
пропагандисты
Yet
эксплуатируют
some
легенду о
Ukrainian
призраке до сих
propagandists
пор.
continue to exploit this legend to this day.
Интернет-ролики — это вообще отдельная тема. На
Internet
начальном
videos are a
этапе
separate issue
СВО
altogether.
от
At
количества
the
украинских
initial
видеофейков
stages
пришла
of
в
the
ужас
special
даже
military
британская BBC.
operations, even the British BBC was
Но
horrified by
потом,
the
как и
number of
другие
Ukrainian
западные
video
СМИ, стало
fakes.
относиться
But
к ним
then, like other
спокойнее
Western media, it became to take a
и
more
даже
relaxed
публиковать
approach
свои,
and even to
выдавая
publish its own,
разрушенные украинскими обстрелами
passing
дома
off
Донецка за
homes in
строение в
Donetsk
Киеве.
destroyed by Ukrainian shelling for buildings in Kiev.
Украинцы и их западные кураторы быстро поняли,
Ukrainians and
что
their
то, что происходит
Western
на
handlers
земле,
quickly understood that whatever
в
was
наш
happening on the
цифровой век
ground
вообще не важно.
was not important at all in our digital age.
Важно то, что и
What was
как показывают
important
западные СМИ.
was what the Western media was showing.
Воспользовавшись добровольным
Taking
отходом
advantage
российских войск
of
из
the
Киевской и
voluntary withdrawal
Черниговской
of Russian
областей,
troops from the Kiev and Chernihiv
киевские и
regions,
западные пропагандисты явили
Kiev and
миру
Western
чудовищную
propagandists
по
brought the
масштабу
world
и чудовищную же по исполнению
provocation in
провокацию в
Bucha, which
Буче.
was monstrous in its scale and equally monstrous in
Несмотря на
execution.
вопиющие нестыковки,
Despite the
в
glaring
нее по-прежнему многие на
inconsistencies,
Западе
many in the
верят,
West still continue to
как мы
believe in
слышали
it,
сегодня.
as we heard today.
А киевские власти
And
используют
the Kiev
место ее
authorities used the
осуществления
place where it was
в
carried
качестве
out
пункта обязательной
as a
программы для
mandatory
зарубежных
stopping
гостей.
point on the itinerary for foreign guests,
Благо находится оно рядом с Киевом.
since it is located close to Kiev.
Своего рода зловещий маркетинг,
It's a
который
kind
очень
of
удобно использовать
ominous
для того,
marketing, which is
чтобы
very
выбивать
convenient
поставки
for squeezing
вооружений и
more arms
спонсоров.
supplies from sponsors.
Буча стала
Bucha
поворотным
became
моментом в
a
поставках
turning
западных
point
вооружений,
in the
что и
supply of
было целью
Western
украинских
weapons, which was
властей.
precisely the goal of the Ukrainian authorities.
Они это сами открыто
They
признавали.
themselves openly admitted
Как заявил
this.
Минотдел Украины Кулеба
As
в
Ukrainian
интервью
Foreign
телеканалу
Minister Kuleba
BBC
said in an
4
interview to the
апреля,
BBC on April 4th,
цитирую, «Бойня
and I
в Буче
quote,
должна
the
устранить
massacre in
любые
Bucha
колебания
should
и
eliminate
нежелание
any
Запада
hesitation and
обеспечивать
unwillingness
Украину
on the
всем
part of the West
необходимым
to provide
оружием».
Ukraine with all necessary
Конец цитаты.
weapons. End of quote.
Войдя во вкус,
Having
киевские
gotten a
наследники
taste,
белых
the Kiev
кассок
successors of the
попытались
White Helmets
осуществить
then
нечто
tried
не
to
менее
implement something
масштабное.
no less ambitious.
И тогда появился обстрел
And
вокзала в
that's
Краматорске,
when the
который
shelling
должен
of
был
the station
закрепить
in
в сознании
Kramatorsk
мировой
came. It
общественности
was meant
убежденность
to
в
cement
зверствах российской
the
армии.
global community's belief in the atrocities of the
Но он
Russian
был сделан
army.
так
But
топорно и
this
настолько
was done so
неубедительно,
clumsily
что о нем
and
теперь
so
предпочитают даже не
unconvincingly
вспоминать.
that
Столь
they
очевидна
now prefer
причастность
not
к
to
этому
recall it at all
преступлению
because the
вооруженных сил
involvement of the
Украины.
armed forces of Ukraine in this crime is so obvious.
И тогда, в духе лучших
And
геббельсовских
then,
традиций,
in the best tradition
начал внедряться
of
в западное сознание
Goebbels, the
образ
image of
русского
the
солдата-варвара,
barbaric Russian
насильника и
soldier,
мародера.
rapist and marauder began to be implanted into
Ровно так,
Western
как это делали
minds,
фашисты
exactly
на
the
последнем
same
этапе
way
Второй
that
мировой
the
войны.
Nazis did during the final stage of the Second
И
World
начали
War.
тогда наши солдаты в изложении
And at that
украинских
point, our
пропагандистов
soldiers,
мародерствовать,
according to
насильничать
Ukrainian
и пугать своей невиданной
propagandists
жестокостью.
and their tales, began to loot, rape, and sow fear
Все мы
with their
помним, как сидящий
unprecedented
сейчас
cruelty.
с
We
нами
all remember
представитель
how the
киевского режима
representative of the Kiev
на
regime
голубом
sitting
глазу
with us
рассказывал, как
today
наши солдаты воруют стиральные
told us with
машины и даже унитазы,
talked with a straight face about how our
потому
soldiers
что
steal
дома у
washing
них такой
machines
чудо-техники
and even
отродясь не
toilets
было.
because they've never had such miraculous appliances back
Сегодня его
home.
последователи
Today, his
модифицировали эту
followers
нелепую
have
байку до того,
adapted and
что наши
modified this
солдаты
ridiculous tale
воруют
to the point where our
электрочайники,
soldiers now
но
allegedly loot
забывают
electric
взять
kettles
подставки
but
под них,
forget to
так
take
как
the
не знают,
basis
как
for
ими
them because they
пользоваться.
don't know how to use them.
Логично вписывается в эту логику и ложь о воровстве украинского
That falls
зерна,
into this logic
которую мы также услышали
is
сегодня.
the lies about the theft of Ukrainian grain,
И
which
во
we
все
also
это
heard
многие на
today.
Западе
And many in
верили,
the West
и
believed in
бедных
all this.
украинцев
They
жалели,
pitied the poor
а россиян люто
Ukrainians
ненавидели.
and fiercely hated the
И факты
Russians.
проверять не спешили.
And
И
yet they were not
исправно
in a hurry to
поставляли
check the
Киеву
facts
вожделенное оружие.
while they regularly supplied Kiev with coveted weapons.
Но с какого-то момента пошло
But at a
у
certain
украинских
point,
пропагандистов все
everything
наперекосяк.
started to go wrong for the Ukrainian propagandists.
Стали множиться в соцсетях
Reports
свидетельства тех,
accusing
кто обвинял именно украинских
Ukrainian
солдат и
soldiers
националистов
and
в
nationalists
жестокости
of
и военных
cruelty and war
преступлений,
crimes began to multiply on
в
social media.
мародерствах,
Reports
пытках,
of looting,
изнасилованиях,
torture,
сознательных обстрелах жилых кварталов,
rape, deliberate shelling of residential
размещении в них
areas,
тяжелых
placing
вооружений
heavy
и
weapons in
использовании
those
мирных
areas
жителей
and
в
using
качестве живого
civilians
щита.
as human shields.
И было таких свидетельств не
And there were not
десятки,
just
а сотни и
dozens of such
тысячи, и
testimonies, but
расползались
hundreds
они
and
по соцсетям.
thousands spreading across social networks.
Так, в частности, рухнули
That is
легенды
how,
об
for
обстрелах
instance, the
российской армии,
legends
роддома и
about the shelling
драмтеатра
of
в
the maternity
Мариуполе.
hospital and the drama theater in Mariupol fell apart.
А потом еще и более 2500
And then more than
националистов
2,500
из батальона Азов,
nationalists from the Azov battalion,
из которых уже успели сделать
who had
мучеников и
already been
героев,
turned into martyrs and heroes,
не просто банально сдались, но и вынуждены
not
были
only had to
отпустить
outright
сотни
surrender,
заложников
but
из
also
числа
had to
мирных
release
жителей,
hundreds
которые
of
рассказали
civilian
правду о том,
hostages who
что с
told
ними
the
творили.
truth about what had been done to them.
Да еще и подкачала украинская омбудсмен Денисова,
Moreover, Ukrainian
переборчившая с
ombudsman
описанием и
Denisova
смакованием
also
якобы
let everyone
совершенных
down, going
российскими
too far in
солдатами
recounting and
изнасилований,
relishing the details of rapes allegedly committed by Russian
описания которых вслед
soldiers,
за ней охотно использовали
descriptions
наши западные
of which
коллеги,
our
в том
Western
числе в этом
colleagues then
зале.
willingly used, including in this
Уволенная, она
chamber.
была вынуждена
After being
признать,
fired,
что
she was
сознательно
forced to
врала
admit that she
для того, чтобы
deliberately
Украине
lied
продолжали давать
so that
оружие.
Ukraine would continue to receive weapons.
И выяснилось, что
And it
никаких
turned out
доказательств, помимо
that there was
денисовского вранья,
no
у
evidence
украинцев и
apart from
западных стран, в
Denisova's
общем-то, и нет.
lies. No evidence at all on that the Ukrainian and Western countries would have.
К этому всему надо добавить видеосвидетельства из освобожденных и
Added to
яростно
all this is
обстреливаемых
video
городов
and evidence
Донбасса,
from the liberated and
а
fiercely
также
shelled
из
cities of
освобожденных городов,
Donbass, as well as from
где люди в
liberated
открытую
cities where
говорили,
people
что если они
openly
кого и
said
опасаются
that
и
if
винят
there's
за
anyone that they do
происходящее, то
fear
только
and
украинскую
blame
армию
for what is
и
going
западные
on, it is
страны,
only the Ukrainian army and Western
давшие ей
countries which
дальнобойное
gave it
оружие,
long-range weapons,
добивающие туда, куда раньше
allowing
украинская артиллерия не
it to
доставала.
strike where Ukrainian artillery previously could
Да
not
еще и
reach.
военные неудачи, вызванные в том числе бездарными действиями
Moreover, there were
и
also the
предательством
military failures
украинского
caused
командования,
by the inept actions and the
бросающего
betrayal of
почти
Ukrainian
безоружных солдат,
command,
в том числе
leaving
новобранцев, на произвол
barely
судьбы,
armed soldiers, including new
и не
recruits, to
дающие
their
им сдаться и
fate,
сохранить свои
and not
жизни,
allowing them to surrender and save their
поскольку сделать
lives,
это или отступить мешают
since they were
заградотряды из
prevented from doing this
националистов,
or retreating this
стреляющих в
by
спину своим же.
detachments of nationalists who shoot their own in the back.
Подобных видеороликов от украинских военных в последнее
There have
время
been
стало
too
слишком
many
много.
similar videos from the Ukrainian military
Да
lately,
издаются они сотнями, если
and
не
they are
тысячами.
surrendering by the hundreds, if not the thousands.
Скрывать это все от украинской и мировой
It
общественности
became
становилось все сложнее и
increasingly
сложнее.
difficult to conceal all this
В новом
from
котле в Северодонецке и
the Ukrainian
Лисичанске
and global
окрестностях
public.
оказались тысячи солдат.
Thousands of soldiers ended up in the new
А на носу
pockets
саммит НАТО,
in
на
the
котором опять-таки
Severodonetsk and
будет
Lysychansk
обсуждаться
area,
вопрос о новых
and
поставках оружия для
this on the
Украины.
eve of the NATO summit, where the issue of new
А его
arms
можно не
supplies to
только
Ukraine would be
использовать, но и продавать на
discussed.
сторону,
Arms that
по
can not only
привычной
be
для украинских
used but sold to
чиновников
third
схеме,
parties
списав все на военные
following
потери.
the schemes familiar to Ukrainian officials, attributing everything to
В общем,
military
стало очевидно, что
losses.
для того, чтобы вернуть
In other words, it
внимание
became
уставшей от
obvious
Украины
that in
мировой
order
общественности,
to
нужна новая
return the attention
провокация
of the
а-ля
world
Буча.
community back to Ukraine, even though it was becoming
Но проблема в том, что
fatigued, a
российская армия
new
давно
Bucha-style
уже
provocation
ниоткуда
was
не
necessary.
уходила.
But the problem was that the
А
Russian
подбросить
army
трупы
had
или расстрелять
not
мирных
retreated from
жителей
anywhere
имело
for
бы
a long
смысл только на
time,
территориях,
and planting
вернувшихся
corpses or
под
shooting
контроль
civilians
киевского
only
режима.
made sense only on territories that had been brought back under Kiev's
И
control.
тогда, по всей видимости, возникла
That is when
идея о
apparently the
провокации нового
idea
типа,
came
якобы
to
нанесенном
stage a
ударе
new
по
type of
торговому центру в
provocation, an alleged
Кременчуге.
strike on a shopping center in Kremenchuk.
В реальности никакого удара по нему не наносилось.
In reality, there was no strike
Российские
on the
вооруженные
shopping
силы
center.
нанесли
The
удар
Russian armed
высокоточным
forces
оружием
used
по ангарам,
precision weapons
поступившими
to
от США и
strike
европейских
hangars
стран
with
вооружением
Western
и
weapons and
боеприпасами западного
ammunition
производства
received from
в
the
районе
United
Кременчугского
States
завода
and
дорожных машин.
European countries in the area of the Kremenchuk
Это оружие и
road
боеприпасы были
machinery plant.
рассредоточены по
Those
складской
weapons and
территории для
ammunition
дальнейшей
were spread
отправки
throughout the
украинской
warehouse
группировки
area for
войск на
further shipments
Донбассе.
to Ukrainian
То есть
troops
для
in
того, чтобы
Donbass.
из
In other
этого
words, in order
оружия
to use those
обстреливали
weapons
жилые районы
to
Донецка,
shell
Луганска и
residential
других
areas of
городов.
Donetsk, Luhansk, and other cities.
Удары российских вооруженных сил
The
позволили это
strikes of the
предотвратить.
Russian armed forces allowed to prevent this.
Поставляемая Западом дальнобойная
The
артиллерия
long-range
дает ВСУ
artillery
возможность
supplied by the
дотянуться
West
до
gives the armed
тыловых
forces
районов
of
Донбасса
Ukraine the
и
opportunity, the
ударить безо
ability
всякой
to
военной
reach
логики,
remote rear areas
исключительно
of
в целях
Donbass
мести и устрашения
and to
по
strike
мирным
them without
жителям.
any military purpose whatsoever, but only
15
to
июня такие
intimidate
удары были
civilians.
нанесены
On June
ВСУ
5th,
с
the
применением
strikes were
полученных
carried
от
out
стран
by the
НАТО
armed forces of Ukraine
150-мм гаубиц «Цезарь»,
using
в
155
результате чего
millimeter
погибли
Caesar
6 мирных
howitzers
жителей и более
received from
30
NATO
получили
countries,
ранения.
as a result of which 6 civilians
Каждую
died and
неделю
more
к
than
этой
30
жуткой
were injured.
статистике прибавляются еще
Every
десятки
week,
убитых и раненых.
dozens more dead and injured are added to
Вчера
these
ВСУ
horrific
впервые
statistics.
применили
Yesterday, the
полученные
Ukrainian
из
armed forces
США
used
СЗО М-142
the
«Хаймарс» по городу
M142
Перевальск
HIMARS multiple
Луганской
rocket
Народной
launch
Республики.
system for the first time in Pervalsk,
Упоминаний
in the Luhansk People's
об этих
Republic.
ударах против гражданских объектов и мирного населения на Донбассе
Of such strikes against civilians and civilian
мы
targets in
сегодня ни от
Donbass
западных, ни от украинских коллег
were
не
not
услышали.
heard once today from our Western colleagues.
Вам нет до этого дела, как
You
не было
simply
дела
don't care
все 8
about
лет,
this,
пока украинская
just
армия
as you
методично
prefer
уничтожала жителей
to
Донецкой и
ignore
Луганской народных
the
республик.
Kiev's methodical extermination of the people of Donetsk and Luhansk for 8 years as it was going on.
Возвращаясь к Кременчугу,
Returning to
находящийся в отдалении торговый центр Амстор
Amstor
удары не
shopping center
затронули.
was located some
Это видно
distance
на видео с
away, and
камер
it was not
наблюдения.
hit. This can be seen on
Попадание
video from
ракеты по торговому
surveillance
центру не
cameras.
оставило бы от него ничего.
If a missile were to hit the shopping center, nothing would have been left of it.
Но на видео украинских же блогеров
The
видно, что от взрывной волны не
by
пострадали
Ukrainian
находящиеся
bloggers,
внутри
however,
торгового
shows
центра товары.
that goods located inside the shopping center were
Они
not
стоят на
affected by the
своих местах
blast.
и
They were
даже не
still
повалены.
standing on their shelves and had not even fallen
Не
down.
пострадали и соседние с торговым центром
The
дома.
houses
У них даже стекла
adjacent to
в
the
окнах
shopping
не
center
выбило.
were not damaged either. The glass in
Это
the
возможно
windows was
только если
still
ракета
intact.
взорвалась
This
на значительном
would have only
расстоянии.
been possible if the rocket had exploded
Однако
at
детонация
a considerable
хранившихся на
distance
складской территории
away.
боеприпасов к западному оружию вызвала пожар,
However, the
который
detonation
затем
of
перекинулся на
ammunition for
торговый
Western
центр.
weapons that was stored in the warehouse created a fire, which then spread to the shopping center.
Уважаемые наши западные коллеги,
Our dear Western colleagues,
я столь подробно изложил здесь особенности
I
работы
have gone
украинских
into the
пропагандистов
details of the
в
work
расчете на то,
of
что до
Ukrainian
вас наконец
propagandists so much
дойдет,
here today in the
как
hopes
нелепо и
that you will finally
неубедительно
understand just how
выглядите вы,
ridiculous and how
подхватывая
unconvincing
и
you
продвигая новые
look as you
продукты
pick up
украинского
and
агитпропа.
promote new products of Ukrainian agitprop
Пропаганда.
propaganda.
Среди них не только упомянутые мною фейки и
These include
инсценировки,
not only the fakes and the stage
но и
incidents I
утверждение
mentioned,
о
but
том, что
also
Россия
claims
якобы
that
препятствует
Russia
вывозу
is
украинского зерна.
allegedly preventing exports of Ukrainian grain.
От вас в Киеве хотят лишь поддержки
Kiev
деньгами и
only
оружием.
wants support in the form of money and
При этом
weapons
вы
from
должны
you.
понимать, что
But you
поставки
must
последнего,
understand that shipments of the
как мы
latter,
вас с
as
самого
we
начала и
warned you from the very
предупреждали,
beginning,
были и остаются для
were
нас
and remain
военными целями, как и
military
наемники
targets
из
for
ваших
us,
государств.
just like mercenaries from your states.
И объекты, где это оружие и
And
наемники размещаются или
the facilities where these
складируются,
weapons and
также становятся
mercenaries are
законными военными
located or
целями.
stockpiled also become legitimate
Как и были
military
таковыми
targets,
ангары на территории Кременчугского завода
as
дорожных
were
машин.
the hangars on the territory of the Kremenchuk road
Киевский
machinery
режим
plant.
целенаправленно
The
складирует
regime in
вооружение
Kiev
в
is
самом центре
deliberately
городов,
storing
по
weapons
соседству с
in
жилыми
the very very center
районами,
of cities next to
подвергая опасности
residential
населения и
areas,
превращая его в
endangering
живой щит.
the population and turning it into a human
А вы
shield.
пытаетесь этого не замечать,
And you try not to notice this,
девальвируя тем самым те самые ценности,
devaluing
которые вроде
the
бы
very
пытаетесь продвигать.
values that you allegedly attempt to promote.
При этом,
At the same
как бы
time,
вы, вопреки фактам, не
no
утверждали
matter how much we
обратное,
may try to deny the facts and claim
мы ударов по
otherwise,
гражданским и
we
мирным объектам
have
не наносили и
not
не
carried out
наносим.
any strikes against
Не
civilian
верите
peaceful
нам?
targets,
Посмотрите
nor have we
свидетельства
ever done
очевидцев
so.
и послушайте мнение
If you do
военных
not believe
экспертов.
us, you can turn to eyewitness accounts and
Они,
listen
например,
to
подтвердят
the
вам, что жилой
assessments of
дом в
military
Киеве, о
experts.
котором
They will
упоминалось
confirm, for
сегодня,
example, that the
был
residential
поврежден не
building
российской
in Kiev,
крылатой
which was
ракетой, а в
mentioned
результате
today,
неудачной
was
работы двух
not
украинских
damaged by a
комплексов
Russian
ПВО,
cruise missile, but as a result of
сбивших над
the
зданием
poor
свои
work
же
of two
зенитные
Ukrainian
ракеты.
air defense systems that shot down their own anti-aircraft missiles over the building.
От вашего нежелания признавать это,
Your
правда иной
unwillingness
не
to
становится.
acknowledge this doesn't change the truth.
В завершение хотел бы еще раз
In
подчеркнуть,
conclusion, I
что поставками
would like to once
вооружений
again
вы лишь
emphasize
продлеваете
that by
агонию
supplying
преступного
weapons, you only
киевского
prolong the
режима,
agony of the
готового
criminal
привнести
Kiev
в жертву
regime, which is
свое
prepared to
население.
sacrifice its own population.
И чем раньше вы это осознаете,
And the sooner you
тем раньше
realize this,
украинское руководство сядет за
the
стол
sooner
переговоров
Ukrainian
с
leadership will
реалистичной
sit down at the
позицией,
negotiating table with
а
a
не с лозунгами
realistic
и фантомными
position
болями.
rather than with slogans and phantom pains.
Мы начали специальную военную операцию с
We
тем,
began
чтобы
special
прекратить
military
обстрелы Донбасса
operation in
Украины,
order to stop the shelling of
и чтобы с
Donbass by
территории этой
Ukraine,
страны,
and so that the
превращенной с
territory of this
подачи ряда
country,
западных
which
стран в
has
антироссию,
been turned into
а также от
anti-Russia at the
ее
behest of a number
националистического
of
руководства,
Western countries,
перестала исходить
as
угроза
well as
как
its
России,
nationalist
так и жителям
leadership,
Юга и
ceases to pose
Юго-Востока
a
Украины.
threat to Russia or the inhabitants of the south and
И пока эти
southeast of
цели не будут
Ukraine.
достигнуты,
And until those
наша
goals are
операция будет
achieved, our
продолжаться.
operation will continue.
Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for briefing on the situation in Ukraine. We acknowledge the participation and remarks of President of Ukraine in today's briefing. India remains deeply concerned over the situation in Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in loss of lives and countless miseries for its peoples, particularly for women, children, and elderly, with millions becoming homeless and forced to take shelter in neighboring countries. From the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, India has been consistently calling for complete cessation of hostilities and advocated the path of peace, dialogue, and diplomacy. We support all efforts to alleviate the suffering of the people of Ukraine, especially talks between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. India has been sending humanitarian supplies to Ukraine and its neighbors, which include medicines and other essential relief material. Reports of deaths of civilians in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict are deeply disturbing, and in this regard, we express our grave concern. In recent years, critical civilian infrastructure in urban areas have become easy targets in situations of armed conflict. The issue of the protection of civilian objects in armed conflict should be considered within the framework of applicable international law. Earlier, India had unequivocally condemned the killings of civilians in Busha and supported the call for an independent investigation. Mr. President, the impact of the Ukraine conflict is not just limited to Europe. The conflict is exacerbating concerns over food, fertilizer, fuel security, particularly in the developing countries. It is necessary for all of us to adequately appreciate the importance of equity, affordability, and accessibility when it comes to food grains. Open markets must not become an argument to perpetuate inequity and promote discrimination. India is committed to work constructively in mitigating the adverse impact of the conflict on food security. We have welcomed the recommendation of the Global Crisis Response Group Task Team to exempt purchases of food by WFP for humanitarian assistance from food export restrictions. India has been providing financial assistance as well as supplying food grains to countries which are impacted by the Ukraine conflict. India has exported 1.8 million tons of wheat to countries in need, including to Afghanistan, Myanmar, Sudan, and Yemen in the last 2 months. We are also helping our neighbor Sri Lanka to ensure their food security. We are trying to increase the production of fertilizers in India. There is also a need to focus on the availability of fertilizers and keep the supply chains of fertilizers smooth at a global scale. Similarly, efforts should be made to ensure stability in the global supply of fuel commensurate with the demand. We reiterate that the importance of UN guiding principles of humanitarian assistance, humanitarian action must always be guided by the principles of humanitarian assistance, that is, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These measures should never be politicized. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by reaffirming that the contemporary global order has been built on the UN Charter, international law, and respect for sovereignty and the territorial integrity of the states. I thank you.
I thank the representative of India for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank
you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the military conflict in Ukraine is already over 4 months long. On this geopolitical crisis of great concern to the international community, China has always made its independent assessments based on the historical context and merits of the Ukrainian issue. Chinese leaders repeatedly noted the necessity to respect sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries, to adhere to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, to heed the legitimate security concerns of all countries, and to support all those efforts that are conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis. For some time now, China has joined all peace-loving countries in calling for a ceasefire. We have been keenly committed to promoting peace talks and made unremitting efforts for de-escalating the situation, early restoration of peace, and mitigating humanitarian situation, and stabilizing the global economic order. It is regrettable and worrying that the conflict continues. The crisis is trending in a protracted and expanded direction. Humanitarian situation remains dire. Civilian casualties are growing, and people are suffering. Multifaceted spillover effects are exacerbating global challenges. We stress again that dialogue and negotiation is the only viable way to restore and consolidate peace, and ending hostilities soon is a keen aspiration of the international community. China supports direct negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. We also welcome Secretary General's good offices on the issue of grain export, among others. Mr. President, peace is for all to strive for and to defend. All members of the international community should responsibly work for a proper resolution of the crisis and avoid contrary actions. All parties should work in concert to create the necessary environment and conditions for peace talks by the parties. Facts have fully borne out that sending weapons cannot bring about peace, nor can sanctions and pressurization solve the security conundrum. Attempts to weaponize the world economy and to coerce other countries into taking sides will artificially divide the international community and make the world even less secure. Delaying and obstructing diplomatic negotiations for geopolitical purposes, or even adding fuel to the fire to intensify confrontation, will only magnify the conflict and inevitably end up in hurting oneself. Mr. President, this Ukrainian crisis has once again sounded alarm for the world. Security is indivisible. A blind faith in the position of strength and expansion of military alliances and the pursuit of one's own security at the expense of other countries' security will inevitably lead to security dilemmas. NATO's 5 eastward expansions after the Cold War have not only failed to make Europe secure, but also sown the seeds of conflict. It is a lesson that is worth some good reflecting upon. The Cold War ended a long time ago. It is necessary for NATO to reconsider its own positioning and its responsibilities, completely abandon the Cold War mentality that is based on bloc confrontation, and strive to build a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security framework in line with the principle of indivisible security. Like all peace-loving countries and peoples in the world, China pays close attention to NATO's strategic adjustment and is deeply concerned about the policy implication of the so-called strategic concept. Certain NATO leaders lately painted other countries as a threat. But the fact is, it is NATO itself that has made troubles in different parts of the world. We urge NATO to learn its lessons and not to use this crisis in Ukraine as an excuse to stoke worldwide bloc confrontation or a new Cold War, and not to look for imaginary enemies in Asia-Pacific or artificially create contradictions and divisions. We firmly oppose certain elements clamoring for NATO's involvement in Asia-Pacific or an Asia-Pacific version of NATO on the back of military advances. The long outdated Cold War script must never be reenacted in Asia-Pacific. The kind of turmoil and conflict that is affecting parts of the world must not be allowed to happen in Asia-Pacific. Asia-Pacific countries share an appreciation for the hard-won peace and prosperity, and a wish to focus on mutually beneficial cooperation in pursuit of common development and revitalization. Any attempt to go against the tide of history is doomed to fail. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her detailed briefing. We acknowledge President Zelensky's address to the Council and his first-hand account of the latest developments in Ukraine. We meet today following concerning reports of intensified missile strikes across Ukraine in urban areas, including Kiev and Kharkiv. In particular, the images in Kremenchuk of a shopping mall, something familiar to all of us in our everyday life, engulfed in flames, are horrifying. This incident has added to the war's immensely high human toll and should be properly investigated. Incidents like these are a clear demonstration of why civilian objects are protected under international law. The UAE reiterates its unequivocal condemnation of attacks on civilians and civilian objects and infrastructure. With the conflict now entering its 5th month, women and children and the elderly are disproportionately impacted. More than half of Ukraine's children are now displaced from home, and women, children, and the elderly are suffering from ongoing violence and trauma and seeking refuge in neighboring countries. It is well past time that we find parameters for ceasefire negotiations as a starting point to end this war. If the conflict continues unabated, we can expect the tsunami of global ramifications to worsen. People around the world are already suffering, both directly and from the conflict's wider repercussions, including distorted global trade, the effects of sanctions, and increased food prices, threatening a global recession. The most vulnerable, as always, are the worst affected. In this context, I would like to make the following points. First, the application of international humanitarian law is fundamental to preserving human life. Compliance is both a moral and a legal obligation, and we reiterate the importance of respecting the principles of necessity, distinction, and proportionality that are paramount in conflict, as well as the importance of ensuring accountability. Any military operation must be limited to exclusively military objectives, and all precautionary measures must be taken to avoid the direct or indirect targeting of civilians. The fact that the war in Ukraine has so greatly affected heavily urbanized areas with high-density civilian populations only underlines the imperative of applying the principles outlined in the Council's framework on the protection of civilians and civilian objects. Second, the international community should intensify efforts to de-escalate and engage proactively to end this conflict. Almost 2 months have passed since this Council adopted a presidential statement expressing deep concern regarding the maintenance of international peace and security in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine, however, has continued to escalate. The UN Charter outlines many of the tools that can be deployed to reach a peaceful settlement. But knowing that the tools exist or that they are at the disposal of the parties is not enough. The talk needs to be walked, and now is the time to have an actual dialogue on the humanitarian challenges and to prioritize an immediate cessation of hostilities, laying out the contours of a sustainable solution that ends this conflict and ends it on a foundation upon which peace can be built. We encourage the parties to seize this opportunity, and we urge the Secretary General and others in trying to bring together the parties for good faith negotiations to this end. Third, helping ease global food insecurity must be a priority. This cannot wait. We must avoid a food catastrophe. We are already facing what David Beasley so vividly described as having to take food from the hungry to feed the starving. Specifically, there needs to be a solution to export the grain and fertilizer that are so critical to food systems around the world. We are encouraged by ongoing efforts aimed at allowing ships safe passage to and from key seaports, including Odessa. The Security Council must do everything within its power to support these negotiations, and we look forward to the Council addressing this in more detail. Finally, Mr. President, the devastation in Ukraine from this war is undeniable. We risk a lost generation of children denied education and opportunity. We need to redouble our efforts to achieve peace and end this human suffering. This Council must exhaust all avenues and spare no efforts to this objective. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the UAE for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe,
I thank
Madame
Undersecretary General Ms.
Rosemary
Rosemary DiCarlo
exposé.
for her briefing.
Je salue la participation
I
virtuelle
welcome
du
the virtual
président Zelenskyy à
participation
cette session.
of President Zelenskyy in this
Monsieur le
meeting.
Président,
Mr. President,
la guerre en Ukraine dure à présent depuis
the war in
plus
Ukraine
de 4 mois.
has now been going
Et ses
on for more
conséquences
than 4
continuent de
months,
s'étendre
and
au plan humanitaire
its
et
consequences
sécuritaire, et
continue
ce,
to spread
alors que l'horizon
on the humanitarian and
politico-diplomatique
security
semble s'éloigner
level
et se réduire
as the
comme une peau de
political and
chagrin.
diplomatic horizon appears to be
La grave
receding and
crise humanitaire
shrinking to
consécutive à la
nothing.
guerre
The
doit
serious
absolument être jugulée.
humanitarian crisis resulting
Trop
from
de
the war
civils ont
must
payé de leur
absolutely
vie
be stemmed.
et
Too
des
many
millions
civilians
d'autres,
have paid
principalement
with
des
their
femmes et des
lives,
enfants,
and
ont été
millions of
contraints de
them, many
fuir
women
les
and
lieux de
children, have
combat
been forced
pour
to
se
flee
réfugier
combat
dans les autres
areas,
villes du pays
to
ou
seek
à
refuge in other cities in the
Malgré
country
l'élan de
or abroad.
solidarité internationale pour accueillir les
Despite the
réfugiés
outpouring of
ukrainiens,
international
et en
solidarity to
dépit de
host
l'engagement
Ukrainian
de l'ONU
refugees,
et de
and
ses
despite the
agences
commitment of the
spécialisées
UN
pour
and
les
its
secourir,
specialized
la
agencies to
situation
assist
humanitaire
them,
en Ukraine
the
s'aggrave
humanitarian
au gré des
situation in
bombardements,
Ukraine is
des
worsening with the
destructions de moyens de
bombardments,
production
the
et de
destruction
distribution
of production
et de
and
rupture
distribution
des chaînes de
facilities,
valeur.
and the disruption of value chains.
Hors d'Ukraine,
Outside
les
Ukraine,
conséquences de la guerre exacerbent
the
l'insécurité
consequences
alimentaire
of the war are
dans les pays
exacerbating
déjà en
food
proie à des
insecurity
conflits.
in countries
Dans
already
d'autres
in
régions, on
conflict.
invoque clairement le
In
spectre de la famine
some regions, the specter of
comme
famine
une
looms
perspective probable
as a
alors que les
likely
humanitaires
prospect
rencontrent des
as aid
difficultés à
workers
fournir l'aide
struggle
alimentaire
to
dont
provide
les populations ont urgemment
urgently
besoin.
needed food aid.
Dans le même temps, de nombreux pays font face à une
At the
inflation
same time,
économique
many
sans précédent
countries are facing
qui met à mal
unprecedented
leurs
economic
économies.
inflation,
Ce sombre
which is
tableau
straining
n'est
their
pourtant pas
economies.
une fatalité.
This gloomy picture
Il est
is,
urgent que cette
however,
crise humanitaire soit
not
jugulée et que
inevitable.
ses
It is
effets
urgent for
soient
this
rapidement
crisis to
circonscrits.
be brought under control and for
Il est
its
encore temps d'éviter le
effects to be
chaos.
rapidly contained.
Les
There is
parties
still
au
time to
conflit
avoid
doivent
chaos.
trouver
The parties to the
un
conflict must
consensus
find a
en vue de
consensus
l'exportation des tonnes de blé
regarding the export
qui
of the
sont retenues
tons
dans
of
les
wheat that are
ports
being
en
held
Ukraine.
up in Ukrainian
Nous
ports.
saluons à cet égard les actions
In
menées
this
par
regard,
l'Union
we welcome the
africaine
actions taken
et
by the
espérons
African
qu'elles donneront
Union, and
leurs
we hope
résultats
that they
dans des
will
délais raisonnables.
soon yield results within
De
a reasonable
nombreux,
time frame.
de
Many
nombreux
farmers,
agriculteurs, notamment africains,
especially in
sont en
Africa,
attente de fertilisants agricoles pour leur
are
culture.
waiting for
Pour
fertilizers
ceux
for their
d'entre eux qui
crops.
font
For
déjà
those
face à
of
des
them
défis
who
climatiques
are already
importants,
facing
cette
significant climate
situation entraîne
challenges,
une
this
incertitude
situation
de nature à
creates
menacer les productions
uncertainty
agricoles.
that could
Monsieur le
threaten
Président,
agricultural production.
nous sommes
Mr.
inquiets des
President,
signaux que nous percevons et
we
qui
are
laissent entrevoir
concerned about the signals we are seeing which suggest a clear desire to prolong the war. We repeat, the world does not need another protracted conflict. That said, the war is not a state of lawlessness. The parties to the conflict must respect their commitments under international humanitarian law, refrain from any use of weapons of mass destruction, and do everything possible to facilitate unimpeded and secure access for humanitarian aid. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted. We condemn the artillery fire targeting a shopping center in central Ukraine yesterday. The tendency to trivialize the threat of the use of weapons of mass destruction is a matter of concern for my country. As a party to the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons and the Biological Weapons Convention, we condemn any use or threat of use of weapons with indiscriminate effects. The very existence of such weapons poses a real threat to our shared peace and security. Mr. President, my country continues to believe that the best way to end the humanitarian crisis and the outbreak of violence in Ukraine is to end the conflict. We remain convinced that the international community has the means to bring the parties to the discussion table. We urge the parties to engage in good faith in constructive negotiations, to leverage all diplomatic and political channels in order to find a negotiated and consensual solution to the conflict. Peace and security must remain the ultimate objective towards which the initiatives of all the parties and of the international community converge. We call for the cessation of hostilities with a view to returning to peaceful coexistence. Thank you. I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement.
I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. I thank you, USG De Carlo, for shedding further light on the situation in Ukraine and the continued attacks against civilians by Russian forces. I welcome also the strong testimony of President Zelenskyy on behalf of the people of Ukraine. First, Norway reiterates that Russia's war is, in and of itself, a violation of international law. The principles of the UN Charter are clear on the illegality of the acquisition of territory by force. We reiterate our call for Russia to stop its illegal attack on Ukraine immediately. Second, Norway strongly condemns all violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We condemn in the strongest terms the reported killings of Ukrainian civilians, and we call on Russia to immediately end these indiscriminate and deliberate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure in Ukraine. The targeting of residential areas, such as the devastating missile attack against a shopping center in Kremenchuk yesterday, is unacceptable. The urban warfare and intensified Russian missile attacks against Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other cities is causing immense civilian suffering. We reiterate our demand and the demand of international law that the civilian population must be protected and that all necessary measures be taken to avoid civilian casualties. International humanitarian law must be fully respected and implemented. We condemn Belarus for facilitating Russia's attack on Ukraine. Third, violation of international law cannot go unchallenged. All violation needs to be investigated, and perpetrators of any crimes must be brought to justice. We support the investigation by the ICC, the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, and other international investigations. President, as the war in Ukraine continues, it is inflicting a terrible cumulative harm on the civilian population, undermining prospects for peace and security. The protection of civilians and human rights is a prerequisite for sustainable peace after conflict. In Ukraine, the best way to protect civilians is clear. It is for Russia to end this war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement. The representative of the United Kingdom has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I give them the floor.
Thank you, President. I don't want to take too much more time, but I wanted to say that the Russian representative can try to claim that nothing is true and make outrageous claims of Ukrainian provocations. Cover-ups are as old as crime itself. But the undeniable fact is that Russian forces are in Ukraine and there are no Ukrainian forces in Russia. There is one aggressor here. The evidence will catch up with them and there will be accountability for these crimes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will also be brief. I won't take too much of your time. I just wanted to note that such statements sound very convincing coming from a representative of a country that brought the world such provocations as the Skripal case or the Litvinenko case, as well as many other incidents that will go down in the history books as glaring provocations and false flag operations. Please keep that in mind next time you try to teach us lessons.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for this further statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, I speak on behalf of the Baltic countries, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. I thank the Albanian presidency for organizing this briefing and Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for the updates on Russia's full-scale barbaric military aggression against an independent and sovereign country that wishes nothing more than living in peace and freedom to choose their own destiny, free from foreign interference in its internal affairs. We warmly welcome President Zelenskyy's participation in this meeting and commend him and the Ukrainian people for their heroic courage and resistance for the freedom of their country and for the freedom of us all. Crime against aggression is a prime crime against the international law. Putin's regime has unleashed a colonial, neo-imperialist, expansionist war against Ukraine, amplified by the obscene, dehumanizing disinformation campaign against Ukraine and the identity, language, history, and the right to exist of Ukrainian people. The Security Council must urgently perform its duties to stop this unfolding catastrophe. As we have seen over the course of 4 months, 124 days now, unable to defeat the defenders of Ukraine in the battlefield, Russia's military seeks to achieve its aims by terrorizing civilians. We have already seen this too many times. Maternity hospitals, schools, kindergartens, residential buildings, and now also shopping centers are targeted indiscriminately and without any remorse. Russia's terror knows no bounds. The shelling of a crowded shopping center in Kremenchuk, as well as numerous other intensified attacks on Ukrainian cities, Sloviansk, Kharkiv, Kiev, in recent days had no military justification whatsoever. No justification other than to kill, injure, and cause extensive human suffering, and thereby hope that the spirit of Ukrainian people will be broken, the calls for peace at all costs will grow, and that the demands of the aggressor will subsequently be met. This is the diplomacy Russian way, by using terror and blackmail. The Russian actions represent flagrant violations of international law, including the United Nations Charter. Russia has repeatedly ignored the calls by the UN General Assembly as well as the order of the International Court of Justice to immediately suspend the military operations in its territory of Ukraine and withdraw its armed forces from Ukraine. The borders of a country are not to be changed by force. This demand is the heart and soul of the UN Charter. The systemic violations of humanitarian law and human rights, deliberate attacks on civilian objects and civilians, executions, sexual and gender-based violence, arbitrary arrests, abductions, enforced disappearances, and forced deportations of civilians, including unaccompanied children to Russia, as well as their illegal adoption, committed against Ukrainian people, amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity, and possibly even genocide. The international community should not spare any effort to ensure that those responsible for these atrocious crimes are held to account. We need collectively to give our strongest support to the ongoing work by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry mandated by the United Nations Human Rights Council, and the work of the expert mission under the Moscow mechanism of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, as well as the national investigation by the Office of Prosecutor General of Ukraine. Justice will be brought to the victims and their families. Mr. President, we are concerned that yet again has Russia resorted to dangerous and irresponsible nuclear rhetoric by announcing its intention to transfer nuclear-capable missiles to Belarus and upgrading Belarus warplanes to make them capable of carrying nuclear weapons. We urge Russia and Belarus to act in line with their international commitments and cease destabilizing nuclear saber-rattling. Any use of weapons of mass destruction is unacceptable and leads to severe consequences. We herewith strongly condemn the involvement of Belarus as Russia's complicit in this aggression against Ukraine. We also strongly condemn Russia's weaponizing food to increase food shortage and global hunger, and thus destabilize international security. Recent reports have shown that Russian forces have been systematically stealing grain and other products from local farmers in occupied areas of Ukraine. As a result of Russia's military activity, more than 20 million tons of grain is currently blocked in Ukraine. We fully support the efforts of the United Nations to find an urgently needed solution for the export of Ukraine's grain and urge Russia to ensure free passage of shipping from Ukrainian ports. Mr. President, let me reiterate that it is the obligation of each member of the international community to stand up against those who violate the principles and rules of international law, including the UN Charter. Otherwise, we risk losing the international rules-based order we built and committed to since the end of the World War II. Fundamental principles of respecting sovereignty, territorial integrity, and refraining from the use of force are to be respected by every country and are not for debate. We resolutely condemn Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. We urge once again Russia to immediately stop its indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, and to immediately and unconditionally withdraw all its troops and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania stand with Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this important meeting. I also take this opportunity to thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing, as well as His Excellency President Zelenskyy for his powerful statement. Mr. President, irrespectively of what we have heard again from the Russian representative today, Russia is waging a total war against Ukraine. A total war which, from its very beginning, 124 days ago, has been in total lack of respect for the international humanitarian law and human rights law. We have a duty to repeat it over and over again, even though the aggressors themselves keep reminding us about the true character of their actions with every atrocity they commit. Yesterday's deadly rocket attack launched by Russian forces on a bustling shopping center in Kremenchuk was just the latest in the long list of those somber reminders. As the heart-wrenching images are still before our eyes, we need to be loud and clear. In only the past 4 days, Russia has fired over 130 missiles on Ukrainian cities of Kiev, Kharkiv, Mykolaiv, and Odessa, to name just a few. By deciding to hit objects of no military significance, Moscow wants to cause large human losses, terrorize the civilian population, and disrupt the functioning of infrastructure catering to everyday needs of ordinary Ukrainians. According to cautious estimates provided by the OHCHR, only between June 23rd and June 26th, more than 120 civilian casualties were confirmed. The shelling of the Amster Mall in Kremenchuk alone killed at least 20 people and injured 60 more. Moscow is not only disregarding humanitarian issues and ignoring international criticism, it wants to show that it will strive to break the resistance of the Ukrainian authorities by all means and costs. Mr. President, with respect to the important topic we are discussing, Russia continues to disrespect this Council and the UN Charter. It is particularly cynical that Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, which has been entrusted with the responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security, is not only failing to fulfill its basic responsibilities, but acts as an aggressor in blatant disregard for this organization and the foundational rules the international peace and security mechanisms have been built on. It is our duty to work together to collect and preserve the evidence of all violations of human rights and international humanitarian law that have taken place in Ukraine. Poland's position in this regard is clear. All those responsible, directly and indirectly, for committing war crimes in Ukraine should be brought to justice. Apart from seeking justice, Ukraine has a full right to defend itself and expect the international community to provide necessary assistance in this regard. Humanitarian, military, and financial aid allows Ukrainians to protect their citizens, secure their basic needs, and ensure post-war recovery. For 124 days now, Ukrainians have been bravely putting resistance to the aggressor's forces, which continue to strive for a territorial grab, which might actually never satisfy their appetite for more. The responsibility for the Russian actions lies also with Belarus, which, since the 24th of February, has been actively facilitating Moscow's military action by making its airspace, territory, and infrastructure available to Russian troops. If not for Minsk's support, Russia's aggression would have been limited. Belarusian leadership should be considered complicit of crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. Mr. President, once more, we urge the Russian Federation to stop the war and to fully withdraw all its forces from the territory of Ukraine. This is the only way to prevent further deaths of civilians. We also urge Russia to fully respect the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine, as well as international humanitarian law and human rights law in particular. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. This meeting is adjourned.